Hey everyone, Pastor Tim here out in the Mercy Church mobile office. We're continuing our study in the book, The Treasure Principle. We're in chapter 5 now, Roadblocks to Giving. I want to start off just by asking the question right off the bat, what are your roadblocks to giving? Obviously in the book, we're talking about generosity. We're talking about how we think about money. But just take a moment and reflect on the question, what are your personal roadblocks to giving? And he offers his thoughts in this chapter, obviously, but I think it's worth just us taking a moment saying, why do I not give more? I think sometimes it has to do with the things he's certainly talking about, like we hold on to our possessions because we think they're going to bring joy. We hold on to our possessions because we think this is our true home and heaven isn't our true home. I also think sometimes we're not more generous because we're just not thinking about it because we're so busy doing a million other things. Busyness. That can drive us away from slowing down to think about what really matters in life, the more profound things. So just take a minute and think about what are your roadblocks to giving, and maybe that'll give you some insight into what the next steps are. I actually wanted to end this week's video by challenging you with an action step, but it looks like when you get to the end of this chapter, he's going to actually talk about that in the next chapter. So we'll stay tuned for what he has to say. Treasure principle number 3 he mentions is heaven and the future new earth, not this fallen earth, is my home. And if you've been around Mercy Church for a while, we did a whole series on heaven. I recommended Randy Alcorn's book on heaven as well. And this is a driving factor for so much of what we do in life, and certainly it's true with our generosity and our giving. If we're convinced that this is the only place that matters and that there isn't treasure in some form being stored up for us in heaven based on how we live now, then we're just going to live for now. But if I believe that I truly have a future home, that will shape how I live here today. So let me ask you question number 2, which is, how often do you think about heaven? How often do you think about your future home, your true home? And that might give you some insight into why it may be easier or more challenging for you to be generous or giving here on earth. So there's a question for us to ponder. On page 51, I put a little bracket around this line where he said, you may have seen the bumper sticker that says, he who dies with the most toys wins. And he said more accurately, it's he who dies with the most toys still dies and leaves his toys behind. I'll throw out an idea to you, which is that there are a variety of motivations that we can lean into to help us be more generous people. I will say, I think a good one on a very pragmatic level can be, if I were to die today, what possessions, what stuff would I be leaving behind for my family or friends to have to sort out? My mom passed away a couple years ago, and she did a really good job staying organized in life. When she passed away, my brothers and I had to go to New York, where we cleared out the house that we grew up in and then put it on the market. But there were 2 dumpsters full of things that we just filled the dumpster with to go to a landfill. We gave away a lot of stuff. We gave away a lot of furniture and such, but 2 dumpsterfuls of material items. You make your judgment. You decide for yourself. Is that a lot? Is that a little? What do you think about that? That's just the facts of the situation. But it was a few days of just sorting through things and donating and throwing things out. So if I were to die today, what would my family have to sort through? What items would they have to deal with? That's just on a pragmatic level, a burden that I'd be leaving them, something that they'd have to actually deal with. So maybe that's another angle to think about it when it comes to our stuff, our physical items. Connected to that third treasure principle, number 4, he says, I should live not for the dot, but the line. And he talks about the dot in time, which is our time here on earth, and then the line that goes on for all eternity, which is heaven and eternal life with Christ. Don't live for the dot, live for the line. The concept is tied to, this whole idea of like, where's my true home, but a little different way of thinking about it. He says on page 53, we'll each part with our money. The only question is when. And then he goes and talks about all these different quotes from Solomon. And Solomon, the richest man ever, talks about, or the wisest man ever, who had all this wealth, talks about all the burden from the wealth and how it ultimately doesn't bring us joy. I would bring out of that another question, which would be, do we think that we're the exception to the rule? right? You see so many people who have tons of wealth and like, it doesn't make me happy. And yet there's a point at which I think subtly, subconsciously, we can go, it'll be different for me. If I had more, it would be different for me. If I had all that stuff, it would be different for me. He talks about that example of being in the airport and the guy who's like looking kind of sad or downcast and, you know, what's going on? And there's the guy's basically like, I have all this money, and basically he's going to fly on his private jet to Florida to deal with repairs at his house. It's funny. I was thinking about that with like movie stars and things like that. Like, how much money, Jenny and I were having this conversation the other day, how much money do you have to not care about, or even think about, not care about, but not think about how you spend? Like, if you have $3 million, do you not think about how you spend money anymore? If you have $10 million, do you not think about it? It's interesting because a handful of years ago on ESPN, on Netflix, there was a series about ESPN called 30 for 30. I think it was 30 for 30. Anyhow, it was sort of like a deep dive into kind of the background stories connected to sports figures. And one of them was about how professional athletes make so much money and then they find themselves bankrupt because they just live such lavish lifestyles sometimes. So you can make a lot of money. I mean, you know what these contracts are for people. They make so much money, and yet they're living so lavishly that they end up being broke, right? It's like insane to think about. But if it can happen to somebody who's making hundreds of millions of dollars and they could still end up in a place where material wealth didn't satisfy them, that should challenge us to think about that as well. So a couple more ideas. He talks about the PBS Affluenza documentary, I guess I would call it, which sounded pretty interesting. On page 55, he says, we think we own our possessions, but too often they own us. I do think there's something that we should consider when it comes to that question, or that idea of, is this item that I have, is this physical item that I spent money on, is it adding value to my life, or is it detracting from my life, right? I can tell you from my own personal experience, when it comes to my little side hustle of my YouTube channel and looking at outdoor gear, I test stuff out and then I put it in a box and then I try to sell it or give it away, because it's just like, how many flashlights can you use? How many backpacks can you use? How many pocket knives can you carry? Not a lot, right? So at some point you say, this is not worth it just keeping these things. I'm going to get rid of them. And I can tell you there is a mental burden, maybe too strong a word, but it takes up mental space to think about that. So just to throw out to you the reminder that sometimes we get items thinking that they're going to be a blessing to us. And like the guy with the house in Florida that asked to repair, the blessing becomes a curse because it's another thing that takes from our time and our freedom to kind of live life more fully and focus on the things that ultimately truly matter. At the end of chapter 5, he mentions that giving is the only antidote to materialism. And that's sort of the challenge I wanted to bring before us. But just to note again, like, when we give, he says it breaks this kind of hold that material items have for us. And so I'm interested to see where he goes in the next chapter. But to think about the way that we break free from being materialistic is to get rid of stuff. It's not just not having the stuff, but it's the process of giving that actually brings some of the freedom. So there are some thoughts, there are some reflections. I hope you're enjoying this book. Again, I've read this thing at least once, maybe twice before, but it's always good and challenging. And I would lay before you maybe that challenge of, he talks about putting these notes into his wallet that remind him he's a steward, and is this a good use of his money? Maybe a note in your wallet will help you to think about how you're using the resources God has entrusted to you. All right. Thanks, everyone. See you soon. Take care.